In the early decades of the 19th century, across the battlefields of the Napoleonic Wars, a curious whisper began circulating among officers, infantrymen, and cavalry scouts alike. It described a new kind of British soldier emerging on ridgelines, in woods, among rocky defiles, and along the winding farm tracks of Portugal and Spain. These men were not dressed in the familiar scarlet of Britain's infantry. They wore dark green, carried unusually long weapons, moved like hunters, and fired not in volleys, but with deliberate, chilling precision. French veterans who had crossed half of Europe began to fear these green-coated figures, and even Napoleon's generals remarked on the unnerving accuracy of their shots. These were the men of the 95th Rifles, the unit that would become one of the most iconic and influential light infantry regiments in British military history. This documentary seeks to answer a simple but profound question. Why did the 95th Rifles terrify Europe? The question may seem exaggerated until we examine the primary sources. Diaries of French officers speak with equal parts frustration and admiration about these British riflemen who could bring down officers from distances far beyond musket range. British accounts, meanwhile, highlight moments where tiny detachments of the Rifles held back entire French battalions, saving larger formations from disaster. Long before the age of modern marksmanship and camouflage, the 95th Rifles represented something fundamentally new, something that challenged the assumptions of European warfare in ways that were both innovative and deeply unsettling to their opponents. Yet to answer this question fully, one must go well beyond the romantic image sometimes attached to the Rifles today. Popular culture often depicts them as Britain's first special forces, lone sharpshooters winning battles with uncanny accuracy. But this myth simplifies a far more complex truth. Rifles themselves were not new. Prussia, Austria, and various German states had long maintained rifle-armed Jaegers. Even within Britain's own sphere, the King's German Legion and the 60th Foot had rifle companies. Nor were the 95th superhuman snipers, who dominated the entire battlefield. Their weapons were slower to load than muskets, and their numbers were small compared to the massed ranks of redcoats who formed the backbone of Wellington's army. Understanding why they terrified Europe requires dismantling that myth and replacing it with a deeper analysis. What made the 95th genuinely revolutionary was not a single factor, but a convergence of technological innovation, tactical evolution, psychological impact, and regimental culture. The green jackets mattered, but not because they looked mysterious. The Baker rifle mattered, but not because it was magically accurate. The skirmish tactics mattered, but not merely because they were new. Instead, these elements combined to reshape the pre-battle phase of combat, strike directly at the nervous system of Napoleonic armies, and create a breed of soldiers who embodied independence, precision, and adaptability, at a time when most European armies still relied on rigid linear drills. European warfare before the Rifles was dominated by smoothbore muskets fired in massed volleys. Battles were usually decided at shockingly close ranges. Officers marched boldly at the front, relying on dense formations to protect them from random fire. In this environment, discipline mattered more than individual marksmanship. But with the introduction of the Baker rifle, and more importantly, with soldiers actually trained to exploit its strengths, the 95th brought to the battlefield a kind of lethality that strained the old system to its breaking point. Suddenly, those officers leading from the front were being singled out at 150 or even 200 yards. Skirmish lines that once exchanged largely symbolic fire now became lethal arenas where a few skilled shots could cripple an entire battalion's cohesion. To Europe's seasoned veterans, this was not merely inconvenient, it was terrifying. It upended the unwritten rules of Napoleonic combat. It forced armies to adapt in real time. It created a sense that the British possessed a mysterious and disproportionately dangerous corps of marksmen. And it introduced a new kind of battlefield psychology, one in which no officer could feel safe simply because the main lines were still 100 yards apart. This opening section establishes the question at the heart of our investigation. In the coming chapters, we will break down the 5 fundamental reasons behind the rifle's fearsome reputation: the technological shock of the Baker rifle, the tactical revolution of open-order skirmishing, the psychological impact of near-invisible sharpshooters, the operational utility they provided Wellington across the Peninsular War and Waterloo, and the elite culture that shaped their battlefield effectiveness. Together, these factors demonstrate that the 95th Rifles were not an anomaly, nor a romantic creation of later storytellers, but a concrete response to the changing dynamics of war in the Napoleonic era. Their rise marks a turning point in military history, the moment when precision, initiative, and dispersed tactics began to challenge the supremacy of rigid, massed formations. To understand why they terrified Europe, we must now turn to the first of these forces, Britain's new and unprecedented weapon, the Baker rifle. To understand why the 95th Rifles transformed the battlefield, one must begin with the weapon that defined them, the Baker rifle. At a glance, it resembled the familiar long firearms of the period, yet everything about it, from barrel to stock, from sights to accuracy, represented a departure from the standard musketry of European armies. Its impact was so profound that it effectively split the Napoleonic battlefield into two eras: the age of the smoothbore musket and the age in which trained riflemen could strike with lethal precision far beyond the reach of enemy volleys. For more than a century, European armies had relied on the smoothbore musket, a weapon designed not for accuracy but for speed. The Brown Bess, Britain's legendary musket, could be loaded and fired 3 or 4 times a minute. Yet it was hopelessly inaccurate beyond 50 or 60 yards. Commanders therefore built their tactics around volume rather than precision. Dense lines of redcoats or blue-coated French infantry fired simultaneous volleys, trying to overwhelm enemy formations with shock, noise, and raw weight of fire. It was a doctrine perfectly suited for a weapon that could rarely hit an individual target at any meaningful distance. The system worked, but it created predictable battle rhythms. Officers marched in front, drummers kept the cadence, and volleys were exchanged at point-blank range. European warfare became an exercise in discipline and timing. Into this world entered the Baker rifle, and its contrast with the musket was stark. Built with spiral grooves cut into the barrel, the Baker imparted spin to its projectile, giving it far greater stability in flight. As a result, riflemen could reliably hit targets at 150 to 200 yards, sometimes beyond. The weapon featured both front and rear sights, allowing for deliberate, aimed fire in a period when most infantrymen were barely trained to point their muskets in the general direction of the enemy. In theory, this shift alone was groundbreaking, but in practice, the Baker truly mattered because of who carried it. The men of the 95th were trained extensively in marksmanship, fieldcraft, and independent shooting, skills that most armies of the time did not prioritize. A musket-armed infantryman might fire hundreds of rounds in training while never actually aiming at a target. By contrast, riflemen were drilled to pick individual targets, adjust their aim, choose firing positions, read terrain, and make every shot count. In the hands of such men, the Baker rifle was not merely a technological improvement, it was a tactical revolution. And the psychological impact of being able to kill an officer at twice the distance of a musket was enormous. The most famous demonstration of this capability occurred during the retreat to Corunna in 1809, where rifleman Thomas Plunkett executed one of the most remarkable shots in British military history. As French cavalry pursued the withdrawing British army, Plunkett knelt in the snow, steadied his Baker rifle, and fatally shot French General Colbert at a range considered impossible for the era. When skeptics questioned whether it had been mere luck, Plunkett calmly reloaded and shot the general's aide as well. Whether the distances often cited in popular retellings are exaggerated is irrelevant. What matters is the effect. French officers quickly realized that they could be killed long before their own soldiers could respond. That single moment became emblematic of the rifle's capabilities and fed directly into their mystique. The range of the Baker rifle changed the structure of battle itself. Traditionally, skirmishers armed with muskets engaged in a kind of loose, noisy firefight whose casualties were relatively light. Each shot from a musket was unlikely to hit its mark unless fired from extremely close range. But once riflemen appeared on the battlefield, the the skirmish zone transformed into a genuinely lethal environment. French voltigeurs and tirailleurs, who had long dominated light infantry duties, found themselves at a disadvantage. While they were courageous and skilled, their muskets simply could not match the reach or accuracy of the Baker. Consequently, French commanders had to commit more skirmishes than usual just to counter the threat posed by a small number of riflemen. Even then, the rifles frequently dominated the engagement. This was the first major reason the 95th terrified their adversaries. They introduced ranges at which men could be killed without warning, forcing officers who were accustomed to leading from the front to rethink their roles. The traditional image of a brave commander guiding his men within 50 yards of the enemy became far more dangerous. When an officer fell early in the fight, the entire battalion could lose cohesion before the critical volley exchange. A single rifleman well positioned on the flank could cripple an entire assault column. This new reality undermined the core assumptions upon which Napoleonic tactics were built. Furthermore, the Baker rifle's power affected not just officers, but also artillery crews. Guns that would normally fire freely into advancing British lines now found themselves sniped at from distances where counterfire was futile. Disabling an enemy gun through aimed fire was a feat nearly unheard of before the rise of rifle units. Yet the 95th did it regularly during sieges and field engagements. The weapon allowed them to shape the battlefield long before the main lines engaged, something that smoothbore skirmishers rarely achieved. And while the Baker had drawbacks, most notably its slow loading time, the rifles compensated through training and tactics. They were instructed to fire fewer shots with higher accuracy, using natural cover, firing from kneeling or prone positions, and moving quickly between firing points. In essence, they represented the first British attempt at professionalizing long-range, precision infantry. They were, in many respects, the early ancestors of the marksman and sniper concepts that would dominate warfare a century later. By introducing the Baker rifle to the battlefield and pairing it with soldiers trained to exploit its potential, Britain unleashed a weapon system that not only extended the lethal zone of combat, but also disrupted the command and control structure of enemy armies. Europe's old battlefield assumptions were shaken, and French commanders quickly recognized the danger. The technological shock delivered by the Baker rifle was the first step in understanding why the 95th Rifles inspired such fear across the Napoleonic world. But to see the full picture, one must now turn to the second revolutionary force behind their rise, the radical new tactics that changed how they fought. The Baker rifle alone could not have reshaped European warfare. A weapon is only as transformative as the doctrine built around it. What truly set the 95th Rifles apart was the tactical system that allowed them to exploit the rifle's advantages and compensate for its weaknesses. In an era dominated by rigid formations, exacting drill, and perfectly aligned volleys, the men of the 95th represented a subtle but profound shift toward flexibility, independence, and battlefield initiative. Their methods foreshadowed the dispersed, adaptive infantry tactics that would later define modern combat. Before examining these innovations, it helps to understand the tactical expectations imposed on the typical Napoleonic infantryman. European armies valued control above all else. Infantry fought in tight ranks, shoulder to shoulder. Officers and sergeants maintained order through audible commands, visual signals, and the constant threat of discipline. Soldiers were not expected to think independently or act autonomously. They were expected to obey, reload, and fire when instructed. Even skirmishers, light infantry sent ahead of the main line, operated with surprisingly little freedom when compared to their later counterparts. Into this world stepped the 95th Rifles, shaped from the outset as an experimental corps. They were deliberately intended to break away from the traditional model. While line infantry formed massed ranks, the riflemen fought in open order, widely spaced, often using terrain to their advantage. While ordinary soldiers were taught to fire in volleys, the rifles prioritized individual marksmanship. And while most infantry depended on close supervision, the 95th developed a culture of autonomy. Riflemen were trained to make real-time decisions in the chaos of battle. One of the distinctive features of the rifle's tactics was the use of skirmish pairs. Rather than operate as lone marksmen or in dense clusters, riflemen worked in two-man teams. One soldier would fire while the other observed, reloaded, or covered. This pairing created redundancy, improved survivability, and allowed continuous fire without exposing both men at once. It also supported the deliberate, accurate shooting required to make the most of the Baker rifle's capabilities. Each pair became a small, self-contained unit capable of scouting, harassing, or delaying enemy formations with remarkable efficiency. These skirmish pairs were typically deployed in front of the main British line, forming a loose, shifting screen that absorbed the initial shock of battle. Their job was twofold: to disrupt enemy skirmishers and to disorder advancing infantry columns. French columns, with their weight and momentum, were designed to break enemy lines through aggressive movement and close-range volleys. Yet these formations depended on cohesion, leadership, and morale. The rifles intervened at precisely this point. By shooting officers, drummers, and NCOs from long range, they struck at the command structure holding the column together. The result was not always immediate, but it was cumulative. As casualties mounted, French units slowed, hesitated, and lost their synchrony. By the time they reached the British line, if they reached it at all, they were already weakened. In addition to open-order skirmishing, the 95th excelled in using terrain creatively. They fired from behind stone walls, tree trunks, rocky outcrops, hedges, and sunken roads. They were trained to kneel or lie prone, making them smaller targets. They used reverse slopes, a tactic Wellington favoured, to hide themselves until the right moment. These methods were neither obvious nor instinctive for soldiers raised in Europe's rigid military traditions. Yet they emerged naturally from a combination of training, necessity, and a willingness to adapt. The rifles were also celebrated for their speed. Unlike line battalions, which marched at a steady and predictable pace, the Light Division, of which the 95th formed a corps, moved with extraordinary rapidity. Their unrelenting marches earned them a reputation for being able to appear unexpectedly on the battlefield, reinforce threatened positions, or outpace enemy skirmishers. This mobility allowed them to fulfill roles that typical infantry could not. They scouted ahead of the army, guarded flanks, and served as rearguards in dangerous retreats. Their speed gave Wellington's forces an edge in intelligence, positioning, and reaction time. Perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of the 95th's tactics was their reliance on independent judgment. Officers could not, and did not, micromanage skirmish screens stretched across farmland, woods, hills, and ravines. Riflemen had to evaluate threats, choose targets, and decide when to fall back. This required a new level of training, intelligence, and confidence. The rifles were expected to think, not merely obey. That expectation created a tactical culture more akin to modern light infantry than to the massed musket formations of their own era. These new tactics did not go unnoticed by the enemy. French light infantry, long considered the best in Europe, found the rifles a uniquely stubborn and dangerous foe. French voltigeurs were brave, fast, and aggressive, but they lacked the range to engage riflemen effectively. The skirmish line that had traditionally shielded French columns now became a contested zone where the rifles often enjoyed the advantage. Several French generals wrote disdainfully of these green-jacketed sharpshooters who fought from cover, fired from long distances, and made the initial stages of a battle far more expensive than before. The rifles' methods were so effective that they influenced British doctrine far beyond their original regiment. Light infantry principles spread across the army, particularly in units like the 43rd and 52nd of the Light Division, which developed their own elite reputations. But the 95th remained the archetype, the regiment that defined what light infantry could be. By embracing open-order tactics, independent action, and lethal precision, the 95th Rifles forced Europe's armies to confront a new reality. Battles were no longer purely contests of discipline and close-range volleys. They were becoming contests of disruption, suppression, and targeted lethality long before the main lines fired a shot. This was the second major reason the Rifles terrified Europe. They rewrote the rules of the pre-battle fight. Having explored the tactical revolution they pioneered, the next section will address the psychological dimension, why these men in green provoked such fear, and why their effect on enemy morale was often greater than their numbers might suggest. To understand why the 95th Rifles instilled fear far beyond their numerical strength, one must appreciate the psychological landscape of Napoleonic warfare. Battles were loud, chaotic, and terrifying, but they were also strangely predictable. Soldiers expected danger, yet the danger often followed a certain rhythm. Skirmishers traded ineffective shots. Columns advanced, lines deployed, volleys cracked at close range, and bayonets decided the final moment. Officers rode confidently in front of their men because the effective killing range of muskets was short. Artillery crews knew that unless enemy guns or cavalry got close, they could operate with relative freedom. Even the most violent battles followed these unwritten rules. The 95th Rifles broke those rules in ways that were deeply unsettling. The first psychological shock came from their anonymity. Riflemen firing from cover were extremely difficult to locate. They wore dark green jackets, one of the earliest attempts at camouflage in a European army. Against wooded hills, hedgerows, rocky slopes, and broken ground, they blended in naturally. French soldiers accustomed to facing bright red coats suddenly found themselves under fire from nearly invisible opponents. The simple act of being shot at by men you could not see heightened fear dramatically. In traditional battles, soldiers often fired blindly because they could not see their targets through smoke, but they at least knew where the enemy line stood. The Rifles disrupted that sense of spatial awareness, attacking from angles and distances that defied expectations. The second psychological dimension was the deliberate targeting of officers, NCOs, and artillery crews. In 18th and early 19th century warfare, leaders occupied visible and prominent positions. Officers wore distinctive uniforms, carried swords, and often stood ahead of the line. They were symbols of leadership and sources of stability. Losing one to a random musket ball was unfortunate but accepted. Being picked off deliberately at 150 or 200 yards by a rifleman was something else entirely. Many French memoirs describe officers feeling exposed long before they expected to be in danger. Once an officer was shot early in the skirmish, his men might hesitate or become confused before the main engagement even began. Panic did not always follow, but uncertainty did. And in Napoleonic warfare, uncertainty was deadly. The psychological effect extended to artillery as well. A gun crew depended on teamwork, coordination, and timing. If one or two men fell, the entire operation could slow or halt. The Rifles exploited this intentionally. Artillery crews came to dread the quiet, cracking sound of rifle fire that could reach them far beyond the range of musketry. French gunners knew that as long as riflemen remained at large, their guns were vulnerable. The early loss of an artillery piece could alter the balance of a battle. Even when casualties were low, the mere threat of rifle fire created pressure. There was also the disconcerting effect of randomness. Muskets produced mass casualties during close-range volleys, but their ineffectiveness at long range meant that soldiers rarely died before the decisive clash. Rifle fire changed that calculus. Men fell unexpectedly at the start of the battle, sometimes before seeing the enemy line clearly. This unpredictability magnified the perceived danger. Human psychology naturally fears threats that are invisible, distant, and selective. The Rifles delivered all three. Their reputation grew quickly. Soldiers tend to exaggerate the effectiveness of enemy weapons and elites, and the 95th benefited from this phenomenon. Stories spread throughout the French army about British riflemen who could hit a button on a soldier's coat at 300 yards. Whether or not such tales were true, they shaped the mindset of troops marching into battle. A French column advancing under rifle fire felt watched, hunted, and preemptively punished. The psychological burden of marching toward a barely visible danger left its mark long before the British line fired its first volley. No image captured this psychological dimension more powerfully than the scene at the Battle of the Coa in 1810. The Light Division, including the 95th, found itself facing overwhelming French forces. As soldiers withdrew across a narrow bridge, riflemen held positions under immense pressure. French columns pushed aggressively, believing they could sweep aside the thin British force. Instead, they encountered a relentless series of accurate shots from riflemen concealed among rocks and walls. French accounts describe officers being hit unexpectedly, soldiers dropping as they approached, and the entire advance stalling under fire that seemed to come from nowhere. Even when the rifles were forced to retreat, they had inflicted psychological and physical damage far disproportionate to their numbers. This sense of facing an unseen threat mirrored a broader evolution in warfare. Throughout history, armies have feared enemies who excelled at ambush tactics, archers, skirmishers, or irregular fighters who struck from cover. The 95th Rifles represented a disciplined European adaptation of this concept. They fought with the professionalism of regular soldiers but used the methods of hunters. It was a combination that unnerved enemies because it blurred the boundaries between conventional and unconventional tactics. The Rifles' psychological impact was reinforced by their reputation within Wellington's army. British soldiers saw them as elite, fast-moving, and highly capable. Their confidence was contagious. Their presence reassured allies and intimidated enemies. When French soldiers encountered the Rifles, they often did so under conditions where the riflemen had every advantage: long range, cover, elevation, and time. The outcome was rarely in doubt. Even if casualties were limited, the Rifles dominated the battlefield's emotional terrain. This psychological influence extended into the aftermath of battles. French officers routinely blamed riflemen for failures in the skirmish phase. British generals praised them for delaying enemy movements and providing crucial intelligence. Newspapers and memoirs exaggerated their deeds, perpetuating a legend of supernatural accuracy. This mixture of reality and myth-making made the Rifles appear more formidable than their numbers suggested. Ultimately, the psychological dimension was the third major reason the 95th Rifles terrified Europe. Their presence disrupted expectations, eroded morale, and added a layer of dread to the early stages of battle. They were the ghosts of the Napoleonic battlefield, visible just long enough to fire, then vanishing behind terrain, only to appear again in a different spot. Their impact was felt not only in casualties, but in the minds of those who faced them. With this psychological foundation established, the next section will examine the Rifles' operational role within Wellington's army, how they functioned not just as skirmishers, but as a flexible, multi-role force that supported British strategy across the Iberian Peninsula and at Waterloo. The 95th Rifles did far more than dominate the skirmish line. Their real power, greater even than their rifles or tactics, lay in their extraordinary flexibility. They were not just shooters in green coats, nor simply a screen of skirmishers in front of the army. They became something far more essential, a multi-purpose, highly mobile, highly reliable force that commanders could use to answer nearly any operational problem. In this sense, they were the universal soldiers of Wellington's army, an elite formation whose responsibilities extended far beyond the span of the Baker rifle's barrel. To understand this operational role, one must look at how Wellington fought his campaigns in the Iberian Peninsula. His strategy depended on maneuver, careful positioning, and defensive battles fought on terrain of his choosing. Such a strategy was only possible if he possessed accurate intelligence about enemy movements and local geography. The 95th Rifles played an indispensable role here. They served as scouts, probing terrain ahead of the main army, identifying enemy columns, and giving early warning of French advances. They were often the first British troops to make contact with the enemy and the last to break off. Their commanders trusted them to operate with initiative across a wide area, often without direct oversight. In this scouting role, their speed and endurance became legendary. The Light Division, which included the 95th alongside the 43rd and 52nd Foot, was considered the fastest formation in Wellington's army. They marched at a punishing pace, sometimes covering distances that astonished other units. Their ability to reposition rapidly allowed them to screen the army's movements, protect flanks, and exploit gaps in French lines. As scouts, they were invaluable. As a mobile reserve, they were irreplaceable. But the Rifles' operational role extended well beyond reconnaissance. They formed protective screens during major maneuvers, disrupting French skirmishers and slowing the advance of enemy columns before they reached the British battle line. This pre-battle work was critical. Wellington relied heavily on disciplined infantry lines that delivered devastating volleys at close range. For that system to work, the French had to arrive in a specific condition: disordered, harassed, and stripped of momentum. The rifles ensured that even the best French light infantry could not approach the British line without first passing through a lethal gauntlet. This screening function is perhaps best illustrated at battles like Fuentes de Oñoro. In the swirling cavalry fights and infantry clashes around the village, the 95th held key patches of ground that slowed French attempts to envelop the British right. Even when pressed by superior numbers, they refused to break quickly, buying precious minutes for other units to reposition. Time, in such battles, was as valuable as firepower. The rifles supplied both. Their flexibility was also evident in rearguard actions. During retreats, among the most dangerous of military operations, riflemen often formed the final line of resistance. Moore's retreat to Corunna, for example, depended heavily on the discipline and accuracy of the 95th. As French forces pressed aggressively from behind, the rifles conducted fighting withdrawals, trading space for time, retreating methodically while delivering accurate fire. Their actions slowed the French enough for the British Army to reach the coast and evacuate successfully. Without such controlled delaying tactics, the retreat might have collapsed into chaos. Yet, the rifles were equally vital during offensive operations. In siege warfare, Ciudad Rodrigo, Badajoz, and San Sebastián, their long-range accuracy allowed them to suppress artillery crews on the battlements, making the initial approach safer for assault columns. Their deliberate fire could neutralize defenders who otherwise would rain grapeshot upon attackers. Riflemen targeting gunners in the midst of a siege was not simply effective, it was transformative. It increased the chances of success during the breach and reduced the casualties suffered by storming parties. Though numerically small, their contribution was strategically significant. Even during major set-piece battles like Waterloo, the rifles played roles that shaped the course of events in ways that history often overlooks. At Waterloo, companies from the 95th occupied a sandpit and sections of the La Haye-Sainte position early in the day. From these hidden or semi-hidden positions, they poured accurate fire into the flanks of d'Erlon's advancing French columns. The sandpit became an infamous killing ground. Rifle fire from this position helped unsettle French infantry, weakened their cohesion, and supported the timely intervention of British and Allied units. Though the rifles were not numerous, their fire was decisive in amplifying the effects of British artillery and line infantry. Their operational versatility stemmed from three core principles that defined the regiment: independence, endurance, and reliability. Officers within the 95th were accustomed to trusting their men with significant responsibility. Riflemen had to interpret terrain, identify threats, and decide when to stand or fall back. This independence made them adaptable across a wide range of battlefield roles. Their endurance enabled long marches, rapid redeployments, and sustained skirmishing. Their reliability meant commanders used them first when problems arose. This multifaceted utility helps explain why their reputation grew so rapidly. While other units were known primarily for their performance in specific types of engagements, heavy cavalry for charges, dragoons for mobility, line infantry for volleys, the rifles were good at almost everything. They scouted, screened, skirmished, delayed, supported assaults, anchored defensive positions, and delivered precision fire. They often influenced battles before the main fighting had even begun and continued shaping them until the final volleys were fired. Operationally, they were not just sharpshooters. They were the connective tissue of the army: early warning system, mobile reserve, shock absorber, and precision instrument all at once. This ability to solve multiple battlefield problems made them disproportionately valuable. It also contributed to the fear and respect they earned from opponents. French commanders recognized quickly that wherever the rifles appeared, they would face resistance that was disciplined, agile, and lethal. Their operational impact is the fourth major reason they terrified Europe. They were not merely effective riflemen, they were the regiment that commanders trusted with the most difficult tasks. Their presence on a battlefield meant that the British Army had a force capable of adapting faster, fighting smarter, and influencing events earlier than their opponents expected. Next, we turn to the final and often overlooked element behind their reputation: the regimental identity and culture that forged them into one of the most elite and effective fighting forces of the era. Technological innovation and tactical reform can explain much about the battlefield effectiveness of the 95th Rifles, yet they do not fully account for the regiment's extraordinary reputation. At the heart of the 95th's success lay something more intangible but equally powerful: a distinct regimental identity. This identity, shaped by training, culture, discipline, and shared hardship, created a cohesive force whose performance consistently exceeded expectations. Unlike many other units of the era, the Rifles were not merely a product of their equipment. They were a product of who they believed themselves to be. The origins of this identity can be traced back to their unusual beginning. The 95th was born not as a traditional line battalion, but as the experimental corps of Riflemen, assembled in 1800 under the command of Colonel Coote Manningham. From the outset, the unit was designed to be different, an instrument of innovation rather than adherence to existing norms. Manningham and his fellow officers developed a rigorous training program emphasizing marksmanship, physical fitness, fieldcraft, and independent thinking. In an era when most soldiers were drilled relentlessly in rigid formations, the Riflemen were encouraged to use initiative. They were not trained to be cogs in a machine. They were trained to be skilled individual fighters contributing to a collective mission. This training cultivated a sense of professional pride. Riflemen understood that their role required greater discipline and intelligence than that of the average infantryman. Selection also contributed to this identity. Although not a formalized elite selection process in the modern sense, officers often chose men who were physically fit, resilient, and quick-thinking. Standards were high, and those who could not adapt to the demands of the regiment were weeded out through attrition or reassignment. The result was a corps of soldiers who viewed themselves, and were viewed by others, as a cut above. Their uniform further reinforced this perception. Unlike the red jackets worn by most British infantry, the Rifles wore dark green coats with black equipment. This was not merely practical camouflage. It was a powerful symbol. The green jacket set them apart visually, highlighting their unique role on the battlefield. Soldiers took pride in the differences. They saw themselves not as aberrations from the British military tradition, but as its progressive edge, embodying a more modern form of warfare. Their officers wore plainer uniforms than their peers in the line regiments, emphasizing function over display and reinforcing an egalitarian ethos rare for the time. Another core element of their culture was the absence of regimental colors. British line units traditionally carried brightly embroidered flags into battle, symbols of pride, identity, and honor. Losing the colors was considered a disgrace. Defending them was a sacred duty. The Rifles had no such banners. Their weapon became their symbol of identity. The absence of colors reflected their tactical role. They fought dispersed and independently, and underscored their functional, mission-focused mindset. Their pride came from performance rather than display, achievement rather than ceremony. Within this culture, marksmanship was elevated to a near-sacred skill. Riflemen spent significantly more time practicing target shooting than ordinary infantry. The expectation was simple. Every shot mattered. This focus fostered intense discipline. A rifleman who wasted ammunition or fired without purpose was not merely inefficient, he violated the ethos of the regiment. Over time, this discipline became self-reinforcing. Officers did not need to compel obedience through fear. The internal standards of the unit compelled each man to live up to the reputation of the Green Jackets. Physical endurance was another celebrated trait. The Light Division was renowned for its blistering marches, and the Rifles were often at its forefront. They embraced hardship as a badge of honor. Stories circulated within the army of their ability to cross rugged terrain quickly, outpace French forces, and appear unexpectedly in positions where they were least desired. This endurance fostered camaraderie. Soldiers who suffered together found strength together. The Rifles' frequent delays, rearguard actions, and advanced skirmishing meant they often faced the brunt of the enemy's pressure. Their shared experiences of extreme danger built a collective resilience, rare even among elite formations. Leadership within the regiment strengthened this culture further. Officers led by example, often fighting alongside their men rather than from behind. They understood the demands placed on riflemen and treated them with respect. This fostered a level of mutual trust that enhanced battlefield performance. A rifleman who believed in his officer and knew that his officer trusted him in return was more likely to act decisively and courageously. Such trust also facilitated the independence critical to open-order tactics. When officers could not supervise every movement, they relied on their men's judgment, and their men rarely disappointed. This culture extended beyond the battlefield. In camp, the Rifles maintained high standards of conduct and discipline. They were known for their professionalism, their efficiency, and their refusal to tolerate poor performance. Their reputation spread throughout the army. To be a rifleman was to belong to a regiment that demanded excellence. This self-selection created a virtuous cycle. The regiment attracted men who embraced challenge, and those men, in turn, upheld and strengthened the regiment's elite character. Crucially, the Rifles' identity was not built on arrogance, but on quiet confidence. Their lack of ostentatious uniforms, flags, and ceremonial distinctions reinforced a sense of purpose. They did not seek attention through showmanship. They earned respect through effectiveness. Their victories were not the product of dramatic charges or flashy maneuvers. They excelled in the unseen, grinding, essential tasks that shaped battles. From harassing the enemy at long range to safeguarding the army's retreat, this combination of innovation, skill, resilience, camaraderie, and humility created the final pillar of their terrifying reputation. To their enemies, the Rifles were unpredictable, disciplined, and deadly. To their allies, they were dependable in any crisis. And to themselves, they were the embodiment of a new way of soldiering, one that rewarded intelligence as much as strength, precision as much as courage. In the next section, we will examine how specific battles, Coa, Badajoz, and Waterloo, demonstrate these qualities in action, and how the 95th contributed to some of the most important moments of the Napoleonic Wars. The arguments for why the 95th Rifles terrified Europe can be stated clearly. Technological shock, tactical innovation, psychological disruption, operational versatility, and elite identity. But nothing proves these arguments more vividly than the battles in which these riflemen shaped events far beyond their numbers. 3 engagements, Coa, Badajoz, and Waterloo, serve as powerful case studies. Each demonstrates a different dimension of the Rifles' fearsome reputation, from their skill as rearguards to their lethality in assaults and their decisive impact in major European showdowns. The first case, the combat of the Coa in July 1810, reveals the Rifles' value in defensive and delaying actions. The Light Division, numbering barely 2,000 men, found itself confronted by an entire French corps under Marshal Ney. With the Coa River behind them and French columns pressing hard, Craufurd's men appeared to be in a perilous position. If the French reached the bridge quickly, the Light Division risked being trapped and destroyed. Yet the Rifles transformed what should have been a disaster into a remarkable fighting withdrawal. As French tirailleurs surged forward, supported by columns of infantry and cavalry, the men of the 95th positioned themselves among the rocky terrain, walls, and folds of ground leading to the river. Their long-range rifle fire slowed the French advance, targeting officers and disrupting formations. French accounts describe the uncanny accuracy and persistence of this fire, noting the difficulty of closing the distance under such pressure. When French voltigeurs approached, they found themselves under intense, deliberate fire from men who used every bit of cover to their advantage. The Rifles did not hold the entire field, but they held it long enough. Through measured retreats, sudden bursts of accurate fire, and disciplined maneuver, they bought the time necessary for the rest of the Light Division to cross the bridge. When the moment came to withdraw across the narrow span, the Rifles held the final line. They stood among the rocks and banked earth, laying down fire at dangerously close range as their own comrades filed across behind them. Once the last companies withdrew, the riflemen fell back in good order, crossing the bridge moments before French columns arrived. The French, frustrated and stalled, lost the opportunity to crush Wellington's elite formation. The combat at Coa serves as a textbook example of the 95th's ability to impose a psychological and tactical cost during a retreat. Their actions saved the Light Division and showcased precisely why French forces learned to fear the Green Jackets. They could delay entire armies. Yet the Rifles were not merely defensive specialists. The Siege of Badajoz in 1812 reveals their role in offensive operations and highlights their lethal synergy with siege tactics. Badajoz was one of the bloodiest assaults of the Peninsular War. French defenders commanded formidable walls and well-placed artillery. Wellington needed every advantage to weaken the defences before the storming columns advanced. Here, the 95th played a role that many modern audiences overlook. Before the breaches were stormed, riflemen positioned themselves behind cover and began systematically targeting French artillerymen on the battlements. The accuracy of their fire sharply reduced the defenders' ability to sweep the approaches with cannon. In siege warfare, this mattered immensely. Every artilleryman suppressed meant fewer grape-shot volleys into dense British formations. In essence, the riflemen were neutralizing the most dangerous component of the French defense before the assault began. When the storming parties went in, the Rifles were not left behind. They joined the brutal fighting in the breaches, using their sword bayonets in close quarters. The conditions were appalling: smoke, fire, rubble, and a storm of bullets. But the 95th fought with determination. Their role in these sieges demonstrates that they were not merely long-range specialists. They were versatile infantry who could handle the worst that warfare offered, from precision shooting to hand-to-hand combat. It is no exaggeration to say that their actions saved lives by reducing the volume of French fire during the assault. Such contributions cemented their reputation not only among their enemies, but also among their comrades. The Rifles' final and perhaps most famous demonstration came in 1815 at Waterloo. Here, they participated in one of the most significant battles in European history, and although they formed only a small part of the Allied army, their impact was substantial. Companies from the 95th occupied the sandpit and portions of the sunken road near La Haye-Sainte, a position that proved crucial as the battle unfolded. In this sheltered terrain feature, riflemen could fire with precision into the flanks of the advancing French columns. During d'Erlon's massive attack, tens of thousands of French infantry advanced toward the Allied ridge. These columns depended on momentum and cohesion to break the British line. Yet before they reached the crest, they had to pass through the lethal arc of the sandpit's rifle fire. Riflemen shot at officers, standard-bearers, and key figures within the columns, contributing to the disorder that ultimately weakened the assault. While the decisive moment of d'Erlon's repulse came from British line volleys and the charge of the Union Brigade, the preparatory disruption inflicted by the Rifles played a critical role. Their fire helped turn a powerful French assault into a manageable threat. The Rifles spent the rest of the day moving between positions as needed, another example of their operational flexibility. They reinforced La Haye-Sainte, countered French skirmishers, and fired upon cavalry and infantry whenever they exposed themselves. Their green jackets flickered across the battlefield, always at the decisive points where precision mattered most. To French troops trying to advance under this fire, the effect was deeply demoralizing. These three engagements, Coa, Badajoz, and Waterloo, together illustrate the full spectrum of the 95th Rifles' contribution to British victory. At Coa, they served as the essential shield. At Badajoz, they became the scalpel that weakened defences. At Waterloo, they were the steady, lethal hand that helped blunt the greatest French assault of the day. The common factor across all these battles is their intelligent use of terrain, their elite training, and their ability to influence events disproportionate to their numbers. In the next and final section, we will step back to examine the limits to their effectiveness, the myths that exaggerate their accomplishments, and the long-term legacy they left behind, both within the British Army and in the evolution of modern infantry. Having explored the technological, tactical, psychological, operational and cultural reasons the 95th Rifles terrified Europe, and having examined the battles that proved their effectiveness, it is important to conclude by addressing the limits of their influence, the myths that surround them, and the broader legacy they left behind. A unit as iconic as the 95th invites exaggeration. Their deeds have entered popular imagination through novels, films, and military lore. Yet their true significance lies not in myth, but in the profound and lasting transformation they helped initiate in European warfare. The first limit to note is numerical. The 95th Rifles never represented more than a small fraction of the British Army. Even at their peak strength, they could not dominate a campaign by themselves. Their role was decisive not through mass, but through precision. They shaped battles, they did not finish them alone. The decisive blows in the Napoleonic Wars were usually delivered by British line infantry in tight formations. Portuguese allies trained under British supervision, powerful artillery, or devastating cavalry charges. The Rifles enhanced these efforts by weakening French formations, but they did not replace the fundamental structure of Wellington's army. A second limit was the inherent trade-off in their technology. The Baker rifle was accurate, but slow to load. In close-range volleys or sudden charges, musket-armed infantry could achieve a higher rate of fire. The British Army recognized this, which is why the majority of its infantry remained armed with muskets until the advent of rifled muskets in the mid-19th century. The Rifles were specialists, and their weapon was a tool optimized for skirmishing. Against massed cavalry or in dense hand-to-hand fighting, riflemen often had to rely on their sword bayonets or withdraw behind musket-armed line infantry. There is also the myth that the 95th were Britain's first special forces. Although they certainly represented an elite light infantry formation, they were not the first riflemen in European service. German Jaegers, the King's German Legion, the 60th Foot, and other specialist units had existed for decades. What set the 95th apart was the effective integration of training, discipline, leadership, and identity that gave them a consistency rare among their contemporaries. They became popular symbols of elite warfare not because they were entirely unique, but because they were among the best executed examples of their type. Another misconception is that the Rifles revolutionized European warfare alone. In truth, they were part of a broader shift toward light infantry tactics that unfolded across the continent. Even Napoleon's armies, famed for their aggressive columns, relied heavily on tirailleurs to soften enemy lines. What made the British Rifles particularly influential was the depth of their training and the quality of their officers. They demonstrated what well-trained light infantry could achieve when paired with a strong defensive doctrine and a commander, like Wellington, who exploited terrain masterfully. Yet, despite these limits and context, the 95th's legacy is significant. Their influence can be seen in the gradual spread of rifled weapons across European armies. By the early 1850s, the rifled musket, combined with the Minié ball, made long-range accuracy universal. What had once been the rare ability of a few elite riflemen became standard practice for entire armies. The skirmish lines that the 95th had perfected were now employed by all infantry. The Napoleonic model of dense columns crashing into disciplined lines began to collapse in the face of rifles that could kill at several hundred yards. The old battlefield of smoke, noise, and short-range chaos gave way to engagements fought at greater distances, with greater emphasis on cover, maneuver, and marksmanship. The Rifles also influenced the internal culture of the British Army. Their emphasis on professionalism, initiative, and physical endurance foreshadowed the ethos of modern British light infantry regiments. The idea that individual soldiers should be trusted with independent action grew slowly but steadily. By the time of the Crimean War and later the Boer War, light infantry skills were no longer the preserve of one or two elite corps, but a valued component of the entire army's doctrine. The traditions of the Rifles, plain uniforms, practical equipment, rigorous training, echo in today's rifle regiments and special forces. On the cultural front, their legend endured because it spoke to a particular kind of military heroism, the skilled marksman operating with intelligence and precision on a chaotic battlefield. Such soldiers represent the ideal of the thinking warrior, disciplined yet independent, deadly yet restrained, elite yet humble. This image resonated deeply with 19th century writers, and later with 20th century dramatists who brought the rifles to life through literature and television. While these portrayals sometimes exaggerated their feats, they helped preserve the memory of an extraordinary regiment whose real achievements were remarkable enough. The rifle's reputation for striking fear into the hearts of their enemies also reveals something about the psychology of warfare during the Napoleonic period. For soldiers accustomed to set-piece battles, the sudden introduction of long-range precision fire was destabilizing. It forced a confrontation with mortality earlier in the battle than usual, at a moment when the lines were still forming. This premature exposure to danger eroded confidence and imposed a psychological tax on advancing troops. Even if only a handful of casualties resulted, the mere presence of riflemen shaped behavior, slowed movement, and complicated coordination. Their ability to impose this burden consistently across multiple campaigns explains why their reputation spread so quickly. In the final analysis, the terror inspired by the 95th Rifles was real, but it was not the result of mythic prowess. It grew from a combination of factors: a technologically superior weapon wielded by well-trained soldiers, new tactics that exploited terrain and independence, psychological effects that disrupted enemy morale, operational versatility that made them indispensable in every type of mission, and a regimental identity that cultivated discipline, resilience, and professionalism. The fear they inspired was not irrational. It was a rational response to a regiment that had mastered the art of making war more lethal, more unpredictable, and more modern. The legacy of the 95th Rifles endures because they stood at the intersection of tradition and innovation. They fought as part of a conventional army, yet embodied the future of infantry warfare. Their green jackets, once a symbol of unconventionality, became the banner of a new way of fighting. They were the quiet revolutionaries of the Napoleonic battlefield, men whose accuracy, discipline, and adaptability revealed the shape of wars to come. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this battle as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.